Welcome to the Speaking of Resilience podcast. I'm Jim Lively with the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities.
And I'm Kate Madigan with the Michigan Climate Action Network. Today, our guest is Bryan Newland, chairman of the Bay Mills Indian community in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and he is a leader in working to shut down Line 5, among many other issues.
I had made the point that the governor had lied to the tribes, and I still believe that because it's true. Governor Snyder at the time had said, we will consult with the tribe about the state's proposals and actions on Line 5. And then while his administration was consulting with us, they were working out a backroom deal with Enbridge that the public had no notice about, no input into, between the governor and a private company related to public's resources. That is the type of action that makes people cynical about government.
Chairman Newland is an attorney, and he served as counselor and then senior policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs in the Obama administration. In that capacity, he helped develop federal policies on Indian gaming and Indian lands, including reforming the Department of Interior's policy on reviewing tribal state gaming compacts. And he led a team that reformed the Bureau of Indian Affairs Indian leasing regulations. Prior to federal service, Chairman Bryan Newland worked in private practice representing tribes and commercial gaming companies on gaming matters, and he worked with tribal colleagues on unique intergovernmental issues. Prior to law school, he provided political and public relations consulting services. Our interview with Chairman Bryan Newland about Line 5 could not be more timely. There is a lot happening around Line 5 right now and over the past few weeks since we originally recorded this podcast. We learned that a Line 5 anchor support was damaged, and as a result of that discovery, the Attorney General was successful in getting a judge to issue a temporary restraining order that temporarily shut down Line 5. In the legal hearing about this that we are watching as this episode goes to air, we learned that there were 2 additional incidents where ships' anchors or cables struck Line 5 in the Great Lakes, unbeknownst to Enbridge, only to be discovered when they were fixing damaged coating on the pipeline. This alarming revelation raises increased concern about this 67-year-old pipeline and highlights the need for Governor Whitmer to join the Attorney General in action and revoke the easement. Go to the Michigan Climate Action Network website at miclimateaction.org to urge the governor to take action and shut down Line 5. While all of this is going on, simultaneously, Enbridge is applying to build an oil tunnel in the Straits of Mackinac. They have to get approval from the Michigan Public Service Commission, and Enbridge asked the commission to fast-track approval instead of going through the full review. On Tuesday, June 30th, the commission denied that request and will be requiring Enbridge to go through the extensive process to seek approval for an oil tunnel. Also on Tuesday, June 30th, Michigan Climate Action Network and the Environmental Law and Policy Center formally intervened so that we can make sure the Michigan Public Service Commission considers the climate impacts of building new fossil fuel infrastructure in the middle of a climate crisis. In the coming weeks, we'll continue to cover this issue in more depth. Joining me to co-host this episode is Jim Lively, Director of Program Strategy at the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities. Welcome, Jim.
Hi, Kate.
I'm really excited to co-host this episode with you because you really were at the heart of making Line 5 the major issue in our state that it's become, and you were at the heart of founding the Oil and Water Don't Mix campaign and a lot of other work. And also, this is where our work together began.
I think it was just a little more than 7 years ago that we got together and first learned about Line 5 as a 67-year-old oil pipeline carrying 23 million gallons of oil every day across Michigan and through the Straits of Mackinac. In fact, it sits in the open waters for more than 4 miles, right there near the Mackinac Bridge, where a spill would be one of the most catastrophic locations anywhere in the Great Lakes. And it was put there in 1953, obviously a time before so many of our environmental disasters, when our government leaders must have had a lot more confidence in engineering technology, because why else would you allow an oil pipeline to sit in the middle of 20% of the world's fresh water?
Right. And also, before we really get into Line 5, I also want to put it into context and talk about the other oil pipeline that runs across our state. So Line 5 runs basically vertically across the state of Michigan. And then there's another oil pipeline that runs horizontally across our state, the bottom part of our state, called Line 6B. And Line 5 and Line 6B pipelines are both owned and operated by the Canadian oil company Enbridge. And in 2010, Line 6B ruptured and spilled over 1 million gallons of oil into the Kalamazoo River. It was the worst inland oil spill in U.S. history, and it was almost exactly 10 years ago that happened. And Line 6B carries Canadian tar sands oil, some of which, so this is the most carbon intensive, dirtiest fossil fuel on the planet. And some of that is refined at the Marathon refinery in Detroit, which is a major source of air pollution in that area. What a lot of people don't know is that when Enbridge replaced Line 6B after the spill, they took the opportunity to double the capacity of that oil pipeline to bring even more tar sands oil to market. And as a result, increase the size of the Marathon refinery and the pollution it releases. So I wanted to point out, the other oil pipelines in our state. So basically, the more we learn, the more urgent shutting down this oil pipeline becomes.
Mm-hmm. And Kate, as you know, tribes, our Native American partners, have really led efforts across the U.S. to fight oil pipelines. We've all remember the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and the protests about the Dakota Access Pipeline, and of course, Keystone XL as well. So we've been honored to partner with the Michigan tribes in our work here on Line 5. And today, it's really exciting that we're going to be able to talk with Chairman Bryan Newland, who is the tribal chairman of the Bay Mills Indian community. And we'll learn a lot more about that work here in a second.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Jim. Let's go to that interview. Thank you so much, Chairman Newland, for being on the podcast today. So I would love to hear where you were and how you heard about Line 5, the oil pipeline lying across the bottomlands of the Straits of Mackinac, and what were your immediate thoughts when you learned about the pipeline?
Sure. I had, been vaguely aware growing up here. You hear about stuff like this, and did you know there was an oil pipeline beneath the Straits? And truth be told, I don't think I ever gave it much thought. To me, the first time it really came into my consciousness was in, I want to say 2010, when the Kalamazoo River oil spill happened. And I was working actually in Washington, D.C. at the time at the Department of the Interior, and started to hear very shortly after about the concerns with Line 5. And I remember having some immediate worries about it, just simply because of my personal values and our cultural values here as tribal people for the Straits themselves and the waters, and knowing the importance of the Mackinac Straits to northern Michigan, not just economically, but also culturally and symbolically. And, so that was when it really came back into my consciousness as, something like that could happen up here close to where I live now and where I grew up. And so my reaction was concern. And I think the first time I was really starting to give a lot of thought to this was I was asking myself, like, who's in charge of this? Somebody must regulate this pipeline. And as I've learned over the last decade, how wrong my assumption was. So that's really when it started to become an issue for me.
Okay.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, Bryan, just for kind of just a little background for folks, I've known you for a couple of years. You have a real impressive resume to me as an attorney. You worked in the Obama administration. Now you're tribal chairman of the Bay Mills Indian community, and you're obviously still a relatively young guy. Can you give us kind of share your story with us of your history and your career
Sure.
path and how you got to where you are? We'd love to kind of get a little background.
Well, I appreciate you calling me young, Jim. I don't feel young after these last few months with all the stress of dealing with that and being stuck inside with my kids. I think probably one of the biggest factors in my career, my journey, from leaving Bay Mills and back here to now is just plain luck. And I don't think enough people acknowledge the role of just happenstance in their own career and luck. Most really successful people have had several strokes or even more than several strokes of incredible luck in their time. And it just so happens that when I was in college, I did an internship program in Washington, D.C. It was the Morris Udall Foundation, a Native American internship. And a friend of mine, Dave Waymeyer, actually wrote the clinching letter of recommendation for me to get into that program. And I was assigned to a dorm room in this program in Washington, D.C. with another Native student from South Dakota. And we became very good friends. And he went on to work for Senator Tom Daschle. And then I finished the program and came back home and graduated. I was going to go to law school, and I had planned to go to the University of Wisconsin for law school. And somehow my fiance and I found ourselves with a new family that we weren't necessarily ready to start. And so I was revisiting whether to even go to law school because I had a new baby and was saying, well, I've got to provide for my family. And I was working at a PR firm in Lansing, and I got a cold call one day from this guy. He said, I'd like to sit down with you for lunch. I'm a new professor at Michigan State Law School, and we're starting an Indian law program. And so I met him for lunch, and that sealed the deal for me. I got some financial aid so I could stay closer to home with my baby and my wife, and went to law school. So fast forward from there, that professor and my roommate from the internship program ended up becoming involved in Barack Obama's presidential campaign. A lot of people don't realize, but a lot of Barack Obama's Senate staff actually migrated over from Tom Daschle's staff when he was thrown out of office. So, that having those ties, those close personal ties with people in the campaign, and then eventually in the administration, was really just a stroke of luck. I mean, they are both great friends of mine. A professor who recruited me to law school is a mentor of mine, one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. And I wouldn't have had my journey without the good fortune of being put in the same room with him. And so that's kind of how that came to be. And after his name is Del Laverdure, was the person who started the Indian law program at MSU. And he is I was the first student in the Indian law program at MSU. Oh. And again, had my wife and I not started a family before we were ready, I may have gone on to Madison, Wisconsin, and I had an unremarkable start to my legal career, and it just, it all kind of worked out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So after the Obama gig ended, you came back to Bay Mills?
No, well, I had planned, so I left about a month after the president's reelection in 2012, and had known for about 6 months that I was not going to stay in D.C. And I wanted to come home to Michigan, be closer to my family, and we had actually never sold our house in Lansing. And so we came back to our house, and I had started a small law firm with a friend of mine. Actually, he started the firm and then I joined him, but it was a 2-person shop. And we just worked from a small office in Lansing with tribes around the country. And every minute of time that I billed out to clients came back to me, which was pretty awesome because I had worked at a large firm out of law school. So we did that for a few years, and then I wanted to do something with my tribe, and so I ran for tribal judge, even though I lived in Lansing and my tribe's 4 hours north up here in the Upper Peninsula, and I was elected. and I was commuting up to the UP once a week to do that job. I would sometimes I would leave my house in Lansing at 5 in the morning, and I would roll into the parking lot at Tribal Court at 9, and I'd throw on my robe and start hearings, and I'd drive all the way back home at the end of the day. And then a couple of years into that, my wife was working from home with a nonprofit out of DC. I was my own boss at my law firm and also coming up here to Bay Mills once a week. And we said, why the heck are we still living here in Lansing? And so we decided to move home. And I moved home, and actually my parents didn't live here, and I moved into my childhood home that was vacant. And I often joked, I said, I'm in my 30s. I live at my parents' house and spend most of the day in my sweatpants in front of a computer screen. It was living the dream.
Yeah. And now you're tribal chairman. So that's been about 3 years. Tell us just a little about that, because that's a pretty big deal as well. Very big.
Sure. This is a job I felt that I wanted to do for a long time. And I also felt that with the experiences that I had and the issues that were on the horizon for our tribe, that it was basically now or never for, it got to the point where it was quit talking about it and thinking about it and do something about it. And one of the big motivating factors for me to run for tribal chairperson was, upcoming negotiations with the state and federal government about our treaty fishing rights.
So I want to kind of get back to, get back to line 5, but also get back to something you talked about earlier. Because, most of the folks listening by now in Michigan anyway are pretty familiar with the concerns about line 5 and the legal and political battles, that the governor and the attorney general, we now understand, have some unique authority because of the easement that was granted to Enbridge for that pipeline in 1953. And of course, all the politics with Governor Snyder and then Governor Whitmer. But a lot of folks aren't really aware of something that you just brought up, which are the tribal treaty rights, the fishing rights that are predate all of that and are often not discussed, but have an awful lot of importance and relevance to line 5. I'm hoping you can just give us some background on the tribe's legal and cultural concerns about line 5 and what you're doing and what the other tribes are doing to uphold those rights.
Sure. No, thanks, Jim. It often surprises people to learn that all of the land that comprises this country and this state was at one point Indian land. And here in Michigan, that land was sold to the United States and conveyed by a treaty. And a treaty is not just any old document that, you don't purchase your home with a treaty. It is an agreement between sovereigns protected by the United States Constitution, ratified by the United States Senate. And our own federal laws say that many Supreme Court cases have affirmed this, that a treaty isn't giving something to the tribes. Tribes had the lands. Tribes had sovereign control and sovereign power for self-government over these lands. And so anything in the treaty is something that the tribes have given up, and the tribes keep what they haven't given up. And in 1836, which was before Michigan became a state, the Ojibwe and Odawa tribes in northern Michigan gave up almost half of the lands that now make the state and the waters in exchange for money and commitments for a number of other things. And one of the things that the tribes expressly reserved, out of everything they were giving up, our ancestors were giving up their homelands, their waters, and took the time to explicitly reserve the right to hunt and throughout the ceded lands. And as part of that, they didn't speak English, right? So they're negotiating a treaty in English in a language they don't speak. But in doing that, the right to hunt included the right to fish and do all of the other things that we did on the land. So it was a pledge. We will give up our lands if we can still do the things on the land that we do. It included the right to fish. That treaty allowed the state of Michigan to admit it to the United States 1 year later in 1837. And it also protected the right of tribes to fish and hunt and gather on the lands and waters throughout that ceded territory. So if you're looking on the map of Lower Michigan, it goes from Alpena all the way down to the Grand River and then the Upper Peninsula. It's basically everything east of Marquette. And that's a lot of land. And so those rights and that agreement predates the state of Michigan itself, and it certainly predates any agreement that Enbridge has with the state of Michigan. And because the United States Constitution says these are the supreme law of the land, our reserved right to fish is protected by federal law.
Don't forget, go to miclimateaction.org now to urge the governor to take action to revoke the easement and shut down Line 5. I want to jump ahead and talk about the tunnel, if that's okay. But to jump ahead, I want to go back a minute and think about how this tunnel deal happened. How back in December 2018, Governor Whitmer and Attorney General Nessel had just been elected. And in the very last months of his time in office, the last weeks really, Governor Snyder and the Michigan Legislature worked together to put together a hasty deal with Enbridge during the lame duck session to allow this tunnel. And so this tunnel for Line 5 that could be as much as 100 feet below the lake bed that could operate for up to 99 years. And so hundreds of people gathered in this church across the street from the Capitol in Lansing. You were there, Brian. Jim and I were there. And there was this, you were on stage with dozens of people, leaders of Michigan tribes, business leaders, leaders of the Mackinac Bridge Authority. I'm trying to paint this picture of this moment. All of these people were opposing the tunnel for various reasons. And here we are really still fighting this tunnel proposal and working to shut down Line 5. So I want to ask you about that moment. It was the first time that I'd seen you speak. I think for a lot of people, you made such an impassioned, impressive speech. I think for a lot of people, we were like, this is a person to watch. Here's a new leader of our movement. It was really exciting. So I'd love to hear from your perspective about that moment and just your thoughts on the tunnel and your main concerns about the proposed oil tunnel.
Thanks, Kate. That episode in the lame duck was really galling, and to me, it was you set the issue of the oil pipeline itself aside, and that is the type of action that makes people cynical about government, because this was done in a series of backroom deals that the public had no notice about, no input into, between the governor and a private company related to public's resources. And then with legislators going out the door in an election that their party had just lost, they rammed through an effort to ratify those agreements. And I will note, because I remember at that gathering also, Kate, that I had made the point that the governor had lied to the tribes, and I still believe that because it's true. Governor Snyder at the time had said, we will consult with the tribes and talk with the tribes about the state's proposals and actions on Line 5. And then while his administration was consulting with us, they were working out a backroom deal with Enbridge without anything to say to us. And you could make that about right to work policies. You could make that about anything else. That is the type of cynical government activity that just turns people off to government and makes people feel like government isn't responsive to them. And I was very, just as somebody who is a policymaker myself, and also a government geek, that's something that really made me angry. And it was very frustrating to go through.
That was a rough moment. We're still all dealing with the legal implications of that. One of the things that is a little more positive since Governor Whitmer's been in office is she was taking a look at one of the important issues that Enbridge consistently raised around propane and the propane supply for the UP. And, we were hearing from Enbridge this, what felt like kind of feigned concern about UP residents and their need for propane. So you are in Bay Mills, which is the eastern part of the UP, just outside of Sault Ste. Marie, for folks that don't know, on the shores of Lake Superior. And Enbridge has been making this argument that we need Line 5. We in Michigan need Line 5 because of the propane that they deliver to the UP. You're a Uper. Can you just give us your perspective on that argument, and also a little bit on what you think Governor Whitmer's UP Energy Task Force had to say about that, and what your hopes are for that task force going forward, because it is still meeting?
Sure. I remember this amusing episode. Actually, I think it came from that lame duck legislative session. I was in a room with some legislators and other advocates, and everybody's talking about the UP and what calamity will befall all of us Upers if this pipeline is shut down. And I interjected at one point, and I said, "Could I ask who in this room is from the Upper Peninsula?" And I raised my hand, and I was the only Uper in the room. And I said, as somebody who lives in the Upper Peninsula and heats my home with natural gas, I can assure you that if you shut down this pipeline, we will not be burning our furniture and boiling shoe leather to keep ourselves warm and fed throughout the winter. And that is the picture that Enbridge and their allies like to paint for the public, is that we are all living up here in the deep woods, and we've got a little propane pig outside of our house, and that's how we scrape out a living. And that's just not the case. There are a lot of people up here on propane, to be sure, but the cities in the Upper Peninsula and communities connected to them get energy just like most of the rest of the state of Michigan. And it's an overblown concern, and something that, it's something we can figure out how to do if that pipeline got shut down. Nobody's going to freeze to death in the wintertime, I assure you that. With respect to the Energy Task Force, my hope is that they find a solution for those people who do rely on propane. But, in my job, I often am tasked with working with our staff and our team here to solve problems. And one of the things that I learned from one of my mentors that I use in my job is say, don't tell me the 101 ways or 101 reasons why we can't do something. It's real easy for anybody to say why something can't be done. Figure it out and let's get it done. And that's really what I would like to see out of the UP Energy Task Force.
That's great. And now the UP Energy Task Force is looking ahead at the future of energy for the Upper Peninsula more broadly than propane. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on that, and also kind of related to climate change, or very related to climate change, and what the Bay Mills tribe is considering or is doing, and if you're looking into renewable energy projects.
Sure. I think climate change, in the Great Lakes, we often nationally talk about climate change in coastal cities. There is just anybody who lives up here in northern Michigan or lives near the Great Lakes, you can see it with your own eyes. Things are just different. Thunderstorms in February. We never had a thunderstorm in February when I was growing up. We are seeing declining whitefish populations, and our biologists tell us that whitefish need a very calm, still cold waters for spawning. And when the lakes don't freeze and the winter winds are whipping across the Great Lakes, stirring them up. There are fewer areas of water like that for whitefish. And so we're seeing those effects here. And as a tribe, we know we've got to figure out how to respond to that. The frustrating part to me is, this is an environmental justice issue because the people who philosophically want to lead the way have the fewest resources to do that. So one of the things we are looking at doing is trying to use the land base that we do have for solar energy development on a community scale and on a commercial scale, and trying to get newer infrastructure in place on the reservation so that the homes and buildings we operate in are more energy efficient. The building I'm sitting in now, our tribal headquarters, was 2 double-wide trailers pushed together with an upstairs built on top of them. And it is drafty, and in the wintertime, you can feel the cold air blowing in, and so I know that means the hot air is blowing out. And we're trying to take those steps too. But the reality is that we're only going to be a piece of a larger puzzle, and it's going to take the work. It takes a national policy really to get this done.
There's so many things happening right now around Line 5 that are, it's a little hard for those of us that have been involved in this for as long as we have, going on 6 years. But there's the Attorney General has a lawsuit that's pending. Of course, the Army, there's permitting now underway for this tunnel project with the Army Corps of Engineers and soon the Public Service Commission. There's more than one lawsuit, as well as some of the tribal concerns. Without going through all of that, I'm just kind of wondering, you're an attorney. Can you give us your take on what you think are some of the strongest arguments and where your hopes would be for Line 5 protection, decommissioning the pipeline and removing the risk?
I think for us, as I mentioned about our treaty rights, that is enshrined in federal law, and we have a right to not have our fishery put at risk. The right to fish doesn't mean anything if there aren't any fish to catch. And one of the things that we've been struggling with, so that, Jim, to answer your question directly, that I think is our strongest argument. And one of the things that we're all struggling with this is just the narrow segmentation of every single government action on this pipeline. Because to the west of us at the Bad River Reservation, Enbridge is operating without the legal right to operate on a pipeline across that reservation. The tribe has evicted them. And so they're trying to find easements to get around that reservation. There's permitting involved in that. There's permitting through the National Forest. They do these integrity digs at smaller creeks. And then, of course, with the Straits crossing, you've got so many different agencies, and it is really like trying to fight a fog monster. It's where do you grab it? But I do think our treaty rights are not only legally but morally. Those are our strongest claims. And it's worth pointing out too that the Straits of Mackinac have an important role or in place in the history of Anishinaabe people, because that is the location where we say that the earth was remade. Just like people are familiar with the flood in the Bible, we have a story similar to that in our culture, and that's the Straits of Mackinac is the place where the earth was remade after it was cleansed, and that's where they're running this pipeline right through the heart of it.
Wow.
For those listening who are inspired to take action, get more involved, what would you encourage people to do?
Well, I think we're seeing around the country right now that direct action gets attention, and I do think that forcing these policymakers who are making these decisions to look you in the eye and answer you when you have your questions as a citizen is the most important thing. which is why, Governor Whitmer has been a very good ally, but I've been very frustrated with the ongoing process because state agencies have been trying to push this permitting process while we're all confined to our homes on the governor's order. So the best thing that people can do is to get out in person to these public meetings. They're boring. They're a pain in the butt. You have to sit around for a long time to wait for your 3 minutes to speak, but it does make a difference. I know because I'm a policymaker myself, and I have to sit in these kinds of meetings on the other side of the table with our tribal members. And I know when you hear a consistent message from people, you can't simply ignore it. And so that is the best thing I think people can do. And of course, the tried and true method of showing up to vote. Your county commission, state legislators, members of Congress, actually, the ones closest to us are the ones who have the most say over this stuff. And those are the two big ones.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And
there may be a time for a protest at some point too. And, we all love a good protest, but, short of that, those are the things that I think citizens can do to take things into their hands.
I think also your story just might inspire some people to run for office who might want to do that.
No, I think that's important, Kate. And if people say, well, what the heck does it matter if I'm on the township board or the county board? I care about line 5, but what can I do as a township supervisor or a county commissioner? Well, I can tell you that Enbridge thinks it's important because Enbridge has sure invested a whole lot of money and time and effort into going around northern Michigan, getting county commissions to pass resolutions in support of their pipeline that they then take to federal agencies and folks in Lansing and say, the people of northern Michigan are with us. So if Enbridge thinks it's important to their fight with the pipeline, that should be enough to tell your listeners that it's important to be in those positions. And a lot of times, hardly anybody signs up to run for those. So if you care about something, that's the way to do it. And you're right, people should do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great point.
Well, are there any other last things that you want to share that we haven't asked you about?
Well, when we first started talking, Kate, I mentioned about my initial assumption when I first learned about Line 5 was, somebody's regulating this. I didn't know much about, energy infrastructure regulation at that time. And the most frustrating part for me and for our tribe in dealing with this issue is just nobody's in charge. And I think the public might expect that we've got pipelines running under the Great Lakes or pipelines running under seawater in coastal cities. Nobody regulates it.
Yeah.
And
not to interrupt you, Brian, but you could almost suggest that in that scenario, Enbridge is in charge. They're running it, right?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. They dictate to the state what information the state gets. They dictate to the state what information they can share with us. They do the same with the federal government. Mm-hmm. But I'll give you just an example with the Straits crossing itself. The Army Corps of Engineers, which literally has the word engineers in the name of the agency, has no responsibility or authority to look at the design of Enbridge's pipeline and determine whether it's safe. In fact, when they put these new anchors in, the saddle anchors they call them, which is a whole new design for this pipeline, all the way across the straits, they only look at the little square footprint of where each anchor goes. And so we asked the Army Corps of Engineers, so you say, you guys are literally engineers, but you don't look at the engineering of this pipeline and determine whether it's safe. And they say, no, that's not our responsibility. That's this agency called PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. And So you call PHMSA and you say, okay, PHMSA, Enbridge is proposing to lift this pipeline up off the lake bed and run it across these saddle anchors. Is that safe? And they say, well, we don't look at that. We only regulate what's inside the pipeline, but anything outside the pipeline, that's not us. And then so they say, you talk to EPA, and then the EPA says, we only look at water quality issues. And they say, well, what if the pipeline breaks? Well, that's not us, that's the Coast Guard. Coast Guard does the oil spill response in the waterways. And so you call the Coast Guard and say, Coast Guard, do you have any say in the design of this pipeline and whether it's safe? And they say, no, that's not us. We have no say whatsoever until there's a spill. Maybe talk to the state. And so then you talk to Eagle or DEQ, and then they point you right back to the Army Corps, and there you're going back in the loop all over again. And every agency has its own process. And so here we are as a tribe running a government responding to a pandemic. And now if we want to look at the footprint of the anchors, you go to the Army Corps. If you want to go to the spill response plan, we got to chase these agencies around on discrete issues. And they're doing it in Bad River. They're doing it in the St. Clair River, and all on the same pipeline. And nobody's in charge, and the burden's on us to try to make a dent metaphorically in the process, and to have our voices heard. And that's really, to me, the thing that needs to change is this stuff needs to be housed from a government perspective in one place so we can comment on it and we know somebody's watching the pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Boy, that's a good description of the frustration of trying to follow the permitting and the who's in charge, right?
It is. Yeah. It's an excellent description. And when we've been following this for 6 years, you also see that Enbridge knew about some of the problems. You can see as you laid it out, there are so many gaps in oversight, and there's not comprehensive and enough oversight of this pipeline that poses so much risk. And then Enbridge knew for years that the anchors were rubbing away some of the protective coating and didn't disclose that to the state. And there have been so many incidents like that.
Well, Kate, you're right. And I don't, I live on the water. Most of our reservation is on the water. And I will tell you that the federal government applies more scrutiny to breakwalls that go in along the lakeshore here than they do to a company that's running millions of gallons of oil beneath the largest body of fresh water in the world. Yeah. And that should be frightening to people.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate you guys taking the time to spend with me and to give some voice to tribal issues, whether it's myself or others. We've got an important role to play in this process. And a lot of people think that because this pipeline doesn't cross our reservation, that we don't have a say. And the Constitution of the United States and the treaties between our tribes and the United States would say otherwise. And I'm glad that you've provided an opportunity for us to remind people of that.
Absolutely. Bryan, you've been a great partner since you've been elected. It's been really great working with you because it takes an awful lot of us to even make any kind of dent in this process. It's really nice that we've been able to work together. I appreciate you and you coming here and spending some time with us today.
Yeah,
likewise. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
and
Kate.
I appreciate your leadership on this issue. And it's just so important for us to be partnering and for us to be able to follow the lead of the tribes on this.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's podcast.
Don't forget, go to miclimateaction.org now to urge the governor to take action to revoke the easement and shut down Line 5. Speaking of Resilience is created by the Groundwork Center for Resilient Communities and the Michigan Climate Action Network. This episode was produced by Miriam Owsley, hosted by Kate Madigan and Jim Lively. If you appreciate this content, become a podcast supporter at groundworkcenter.org/podcast. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast wherever you listen in. subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on Facebook at Groundwork Center and at Michigan Climate Action Network.